across the state economy, across all sectors by 2045. None of these are specific to transportation, and no one has identified exactly what role the transportation sector needs to or can play in reaching these kinds of reductions. And so we've thought about different kinds of scenarios, and we've been working on 80% reduction scenarios for some time, and decided to just stick with that and see what we can do with that kind of reduction in transportation. It may not be enough. It may be that other sectors can go a little farther, or some can go negative, and things like land use change can work in our favor, but we may come back and find later that we need to do even better than we're presenting in this study so far. But at least we're looking at cars and trucks going to 80% reduction in CO2. There are definitely some boundaries here, some scope limitations and ground rules that we want to cover. All of these things I'm sure we can have a good conversation on, but we'll just try to lay them out there briefly to begin with. The study is focused on vehicles and fuels. We are not looking at changes in travel patterns or land use change or other things that also could be part of a greenhouse gas reduction strategy. This is basically a vehicles and fuels study. We're focusing on greenhouse gases. We are not focusing on pollutant emissions here, and we know that, for example, NOx in this state is a big challenge, and there may be changes, for example, a shift to ZEV vehicles that have to happen even faster to meet NOx targets than what we're showing here for greenhouse gas scenarios. We are using a previous work we've done that's cost minimization related, and we've also done some vehicle choice work, particularly on trucks that's new, but we're not going to get into presenting those things here. They fed into this analysis, and ultimately what we're showing here, we're going to call a backcasting effort to see what it looks like. Two of many ways, or three of many ways to get to 80% greenhouse gas reductions. We are looking at transitions to zero emission vehicles and also plug-in hybrid vehicles to a minor degree, at least for trucks, a bigger degree for cars, so near ZEVs, and also to other very low carbon pathway aspects that include the relevant energy carriers. You cannot get to very low CO2 equivalent emissions without deep reductions in the carbon intensity of fuels. So that includes electricity, hydrogen, and biofuels. We will present one scenario that's very focused on advanced biofuels, and we want to be clear that most of these by 2050 have to be quite different than the way we think of biofuels today. They will have to be cellulose derived in all likelihood, whereas very few today come from that kind of a feedstock. Finally, we'll present some cost estimates. We've estimated cumulative costs of these scenarios out to 2050, including vehicle purchase costs or retail price equivalents and fuel purchase costs that reflect changes in various technologies and systems, and we'll get into that. We aren't looking at every kind of cost. We are not discounting costs into the future, and there's a few other caveats on that, but it gives some big picture results on the cost of these scenarios. There are three. I'm going to hand it over to Marshall now to tell us about the scenarios.
So we've created three what-if vehicle and fuel market penetration scenarios to look at things like greenhouse gas reductions, overall costs, fuel consumption, and so on. The first scenario is a business as usual scenario. Essentially, we freeze policies at roughly 2017. We look at current and past trends and extrapolate out to 2050. So in light-duty vehicles, the current market penetration of ZEVs is kept roughly the same from now out to 2050. In trucks, we have almost no market penetration of ZEVs until about 2040, and after that, it's very modest. Our second scenario is a ZEV scenario where we have very high ZEV market penetration, up to 100% sales shares in 2025, and we assume very low carbon electricity and hydrogen production. Final scenario is our ZEV plus biofuel scenario, where we ratchet back the ZEV market penetration down to something like 60 to a little over 80% sales shares in 2050, and we have much increased penetration of biofuels. Ethanol represents about 60% of the ethanol plus gasoline mix. Diesel biofuels reach 100% of diesel fuel, and renewable natural gas reaches 75% of the total natural gas. Both the ZEV scenario and the ZEV plus biofuel scenario reduce greenhouse gases by 80% from 1990 through 2050. We've used two models, or we've developed two models for this analysis. We have a truck choice model, which attempts to understand how fleets make purchase decisions for new vehicles. It's just a truck model. The inputs for vehicles and fuels are things like capital costs, fuel economy, fuel costs, fuel carbon intensities, vehicle miles traveled, and so on. We also have purchase decision factors such as risk or uncertainty for new technologies, refueling inconvenience, such as how many fueling stations are there to refuel at for a particular fuel, how many OEMs are actually producing particular technologies, incentives, and so on. The outputs from this model are sales shares for each truck type and technology year by year through 2050. The second model is the transportation transitions model. It's a stock turnover model, including both light-duty vehicles and trucks. The inputs are essentially the same as the truck choice model, and the outputs are things like fleet stock, vehicle and fuel costs, greenhouse gas emissions, fuel consumption, and so on. So this slide shows the flow of these models. On the left in yellow is the truck choice model and the inputs for both vehicles and fuels. The outputs, the technology market share, are the sales shares for the technologies and truck types presented to the transportation transitions model. That model has two modules, a vehicle module and a fuel module, both receiving inputs on vehicles and fuels. The two modules share information, vehicle stock, fuel demand, and then the fuel module passes back fuel costs and fuel carbon intensities. And the outputs are, as I said, fleet composition, the costs for these scenarios, fuel composition, and greenhouse gas emissions. In order to estimate vehicle costs, what we do is we take glider costs and add component costs. The components are things like engines, after treatment, batteries, fuel cells, power electronics, fuel storage, and so on. These component costs in general for the advanced technologies start rather high. So for batteries in terms of dollars per kilowatt hour, fuel cells in terms of dollars per kilowatt, they'll start high. They decrease fairly rapidly to roughly 2030 or so, and then tend to asymptote out to 2050. On the left here, we show car costs, and for a bunch of technologies. The top one is, the blue is battery electric, red is fuel cell, the green ones are plug-in hybrids. We have hybrids, natural gas, and conventional vehicles. On the right, we show long-haul truck costs for fuel cells in red, natural gas in purple, and orange is diesel. So you can see that for the advanced technologies, the capital cost reduces significantly to about 2030 and then asymptotes out. All of the costs tend to be fairly similar by the time you get out to 2050. For diesel and gasoline vehicles, conventional vehicles, the costs actually increase because we assume engine costs and after treatment costs will go up to meet emissions regulations.
And back to me, and I'll just also mention, I'm just going to back up for a quick second to say we also, of course, are estimating costs for other car and truck types. We have actually 10 different categories that we've done this for, and we'll get into that in a little more detail in a minute, but we just showed two examples here. On the fuel side, a similar kind of approach. We looked at the technologies to produce fuels and different kind of fuel pathways, particularly trying to look at advanced pathways. So for the biofuels, we are looking at the near term are biodiesels from fatty acid methyl esters and increasingly from hydrotreated systems, hydrotreated oils, but then eventually, HEFA is the usual acronym, but then eventually shifting to cellulose-derived biodiesels. And same story on the ethanol side, shifting to cellulose-derived ethanol. And actually, we just noticed yesterday that this figure on the left kind of mixes a little bit, blends with these individual kind of streams. But again, the point is that we start with some higher costs. The renewable diesel costs are a little bit higher, and other costs are changing over time. The ethanol is a blend of the near term and long term, and actually the price rises over time as we mix in more and more cellulose. They do all end up fairly close together by 2050. On the gaseous side, there's not as much convergence. Compressed fossil natural gas stays low, and even with renewable diesel mixed in, it stays at a fairly low price into the future, although it rises a little bit. The hydrogen price is a big area, a very important area, and an area of a lot of speculation, but we estimate that as the hydrogen system grows, which it does in this study, that we get these kind of positive synergies, and the cost to produce hydrogen and deliver it to vehicles keeps dropping over time, even as we go to low greenhouse gas, mostly electrolytic hydrogen, and it reaches $6 a gallon gasoline equivalent by 2035. Which brings us to one of the real punchlines here, which is what do the scenarios look like in terms of vehicle sales? So here we show we break all of our vehicles into four main types. You've got light duty, you've got long haul trucks and non-long haul trucks, is the LH there in the legend, and then there's transit buses. We did include the fact that transit buses, so this is the ZEV scenario. We're not showing you the BAU, but the rates of penetration are very low in the BAU. But here in the ZEV scenario, these ZEV versions of these vehicles rise rapidly, certainly after 2030. Transit buses reach 100% ZEVs by 2030, and that is legislated. And then we've got light duty and non-long haul trucks getting close to 100% by 2045, and long haul trucks taking longer, basically starting a little later, much more focused, as you'll see in a minute, on fuel cells than some of the other types of vehicles. And it just, we're just playing this as slowly as we can and still hit the targets, basically. That's the ZEV scenario in a nutshell. The alternative scenario, the ZEV plus biofuel scenario, is here, and we do lower, except for the transit buses, we lower the rate of penetration of ZEVs in all the other scenarios, the other truck vehicle types. We do still have a strong penetration of ZEVs. It's not like we're not using ZEVs at all. They're coming in, they're just coming in a little more slowly and hitting a lower target by 2050, for example. Long haul is a 30% penetration, excuse me, 40% penetration, rather than here it was an 80% penetration. In order to be able to hit the targets with that kind of lower set of penetrations, we need biofuels, and so we'll come back to that in a second.
Okay, this slide shows the sales shares for 2 years, 2030 and 2050, for the three scenarios, business as usual, ZEV, and ZEV plus biofuels, for three classes of vehicles. The left third are light-duty vehicles, the middle third are long-haul trucks, and the right third are a combination of all the other trucks. And what you can see, the two left bars for each section are BAU. These are dominated by conventional fuels, diesel and gasoline. By 2050, there's a little bit of penetration of hydrogen and electricity. For the ZEV scenario, these are the middle bars. You see by 2050, for light-duty vehicles and for other trucks, 100% of the sales shares are ZEVs, split between the red fuel cell and the blue battery electric. For long-haul trucks, the sales shares are 80%, and the red represents just fuel cell trucks, no battery electric trucks. The ZEV plus biofuel scenarios show slightly less penetration of battery electric and fuel cells, less than the ZEV scenario, so there's still some modest amount or significant amount of diesel and gasoline. This figure shows the 2050 sales shares for the ZEV scenario broken out by our 10 vehicle types. The left two bars are for light-duty vehicles, cars and light-duty trucks. The right 8 bars are for trucks, where starting from the leftmost one is long haul, short haul, medium duty urban, buses, vocational vehicles, and heavy duty pickups and vans. You can see that for essentially all the vehicle types, 100% of the sales shares are either ZEV, red is fuel cell, blue battery electric. Light duty trucks have a very small percentage of plug-in hybrids. The one exception to this is long haul, where 80% of the sales shares are fuel cell and 20% are diesel. 2 truck types, transit buses and heavy duty vocational, in this particular scenario are 100% battery electric. All the other vehicles have some percentage of fuel cells and battery electric. This slide shows the 2050 fleet stock for the ZEV scenario. So just because we've reached 100% sales shares in 2050 doesn't mean that the actual fleet has turned over all the vehicles to be ZEVs. For almost all the vehicle types, you see the combination of red fuel cell, blue battery electric, and green plug-in hybrid reach about 80% of the fleet stock. Light duty trucks, that combination is closer to 70%. For long haul vehicles, the fuel cells are slightly over 50% of the stock, but that means there's a significant percentage of diesel trucks still there. Transit buses, because of the very rapid ramp up of sales shares of battery electric vehicles, reach 100% of the stock by 2050 to be battery electric.
So all of that then leads to the question of what does it mean for fuel use? And this slide is showing us the time evolution of fuel use by fuel type in these different scenarios. You can see that in the business as usual, there actually is a strong decline in fuel use. This is mainly due to efficiency improvements that we do capture in the business as usual, but there's not much shift in the kinds of fuels used. It's mainly gasoline and diesel with a little bit of ethanol, mostly for light duty, and just a little bit of other fuels. But if you get into the ZEV scenario and the ZEV plus biofuels, you're getting a little bit more change in 2030, not a huge amount more change. You're certainly getting more biodiesel in the ZEV scenario, ZEV plus biofuel scenario, and more ethanol. But by 2050, it's something like a revolution in the kinds of fuels we use and in the amounts of fuel. So the ZEV scenario has cut fuel use by more than half compared to 2010, and more than half of the fuel in the ZEV scenario is either hydrogen or electricity, and the hydrogen is actually the #1 fuel on an energy basis that we use in cars and trucks in California. In the ZEV plus biofuels, there's less hydrogen and electricity, but a lot of biofuels. This is almost all, not almost all, but a significant share of this is advanced cellulose biofuels, about 50% of the biodiesel, and about a little more than half the ethanol. And you can see that here. This zooms in on the biofuel part of the picture. The dark green bars are the 2050 bars. We're only showing the ZEV plus biofuel scenario here because it's the most interesting one for biofuels. And you can see that for ethanol, cellulosic ethanol starts to rise in the late 2020s. It's significant by 2030, and it's dominant by 2050 at 1.4 billion gallons gasoline equivalent per day. And for biodiesel, the advanced biodiesel, also mainly cellulosic, is rising rapidly, and also it matches the HEFA type of biodiesel by 2050. So it's more of a 50-50 thing in that case. Renewable natural gas is growing, but it's limited, and we don't see it going above 0.2 billion gallons gasoline equivalent in transportation. We assume a certain amount is going into the pipeline system, and that's, of course, an area that one could talk about. And then the effect of all of that on greenhouse gases is shown here, and we won't go through this in any detail, but if you can, I'll try to point at a couple of things. You can see that in all of the ZEV and ZEV plus biofuel cases for light duty vehicles and trucks, we get below an 80% reduction relative to 2010, and that gets us roughly to 80% for 1990, which we didn't use in most of the analysis we did, although we do try to reach 1990, 80% below kind of relationship. But we had much better data for 2010, so we built our analysis off of 2010, and that's what's shown here. But in any case, we, on average, when we combine it, are in the low 80s for reduction of CO2 equivalent emissions. Which brings us to cost, and that's our last major topic this morning. And I'll first present an overview of cost. And I think this slide on the left is interesting because at first glance, when you add up the costs across 35 years from 2015 to 2050, the cumulative costs, they are pretty similar across the three scenarios. You almost can't see any difference in the scale of trillions of dollars. So over 35 years, we'll spend an estimated $4 trillion on vehicles and fuels for cars and trucks in the state. And obviously a little more, almost twice as much on vehicles than fuels, and quite a bit more on cars than trucks. But if you then start to zoom in on the differences across scenario, you still see some pretty big numbers that are concerning, on the order of $100 billion, let's say, of increased cost for vehicles. That's one of the issues that is very concerning to various stakeholders and to the general public. On the other hand, we're estimating that fuel savings is even bigger in the ZEV scenario and offsets over the full time frame, it more than offsets the increased cost of the vehicles. The total is shown here, and you can see a slight negative on the total cost. In the ZEV plus biofuels, it's pretty similar. The costs of the vehicles are not as much greater than the business as usual. The savings from fuels is not as much greater as the business as usual. And on net, it's a slight increase. But these feel big when you look at some numbers, but they're not that big relative to everything else we're seeing here. But let's look at how it evolves. Back to Marshall.
Okay, the next two slides will show the cost difference between our advanced scenarios, the ZEV and ZEV plus biofuel scenario versus the business as usual scenario. So on the left figure, we're looking at the cost difference for both light-duty vehicles and trucks between the ZEV scenario and the business as usual scenario. We do the costing for vehicles, taking all of the capital cost of a vehicle purchased in a given year allocated to that particular year. We don't discount it over some number of years. For fuel, we take the entire fleet fuel usage and cost for that fuel allocated to that year. So these figures show three plots, three lines. The blue are the cost difference for vehicles, the orange is the cost difference for fuel, and the gray is the sum of those two, the total cost difference. So if you look at the vehicle blue curve, you see it rising as the market penetration, the sales shares of ZEVs increases. ZEVs are more expensive than the conventional vehicles, so that cost difference grows, meaning the ZEV scenario is more expensive than the business as usual. As the capital cost of ZEVs decrease over time, that cost difference plateaus and then starts to decrease. But the blue curve always stays above zero, meaning the cost of ZEVs for any given year is higher than the cost of vehicles in the business as usual scenario. The orange curve shows fuel savings right from the beginning. Basically, ZEVs have higher fuel economy, and the cost for their fuels is not so high, such that you do get fuel savings. And as you add more and more ZEVs to the fleet, those fuel savings grow. And so you see the orange curve go down. But the sum of the two, the gray curve, starts off higher because the vehicles dominate in the beginning, but eventually turns and decreases. And around 2030, for this case, it crosses zero. That period from the sort of the present to 2030 shows a bubble, and that's the increase in the ZEV scenario relative to business as usual scenario in this beginning time period. And that's a significant cost. As you get out past 2030, you start to recoup those costs, and you save year by year, and the savings actually increase. The right-hand pane shows the exact same thing, but instead of for the ZEV scenario, the ZEV plus biofuels scenario relative to BAU. The curves, essentially, the shapes look the same. The difference is that you have fewer ZEVs in the ZEV plus biofuel scenario. So the vehicle curve doesn't go quite as high, the cost difference, as in the ZEV scenario. You just don't have as many ZEVs. The same is true of the fuel savings on the orange curve, because you don't have enough ZEVs, you don't get quite as much fuel savings in that scenario. The gray is the total, and you can see again it has roughly the same shape, but it crosses zero later, at about 2040. So that hump between the present and 2040 is actually larger. It's more expensive for the ZEV plus biofuel scenario relative to BAU than the ZEV is relative to BAU. But after 2040, you start to recuperate savings. So these two figures show exactly the same thing, but what we've done, this is for the ZEV minus BAU scenario. On the left-hand side is a high fuel price case. Diesel and gasoline, we've increased by 20% the costs. On the right-hand side, we have a low fuel price case. Diesel and gasoline are 20% lower than our baseline. So the shape of the curves looks the same. In fact, the blue curves are identical. Nothing has changed with the vehicles. What's changed is fuel savings. On the left-hand side, because of the fossil fuels are higher priced, you see much greater fuel savings. The total curve, the gray curve, actually crosses the axis a little bit earlier than the baseline case in about 2028, but the overall cost savings are much larger. In the low fuel price case on the right, the fuel savings are much less than in the baseline case, and the gray curve crosses zero around 2045 and really doesn't have much savings out past that. So the overall savings are actually, and from the period 2015 to 2050, it's much more costly for the ZEV scenario in this particular case, low price case. So those are some of the sensitivities we've done in the paper. We do some more sensitivities to look at things like battery costs, hydrogen costs, and so on.
So that's the analysis. Colin will comment on that and also on some policy aspects. I thought I'd put out a couple of things to warm him up on policy implications that are in our report. We did not do a detailed policy analysis in this study. That could be a follow-up thing to do. We do think there are several implications that come from this. It's clear that given especially the near-term increase in the price of vehicles in these scenarios, they suggest the need for ongoing policy support to address that. It seems unlikely that even with a total cost of ownership that's similar, that with a higher vehicle price and fuel savings, that you wouldn't need any policy support. So that price gap seems like something you have to deal with, and that goes on for at least the next decade in most of these scenarios. I think they will be more easily phased out once per vehicle cost declines sufficiently to fully establish the market. A lot of this is growing the market into much larger numbers of vehicle and more fuel than we have now. It's very difficult to predict when that will happen. If battery technology advances sufficiently to allow penetration into the longer range truck applications, which we are not assuming in this study, that could fundamentally change the overall economics and the expected vehicle portfolio and obviate, let's say, much of the need for more expensive fuel cell trucks. A lot of this was that we really needed the fuel cell trucks for long haul, and that grows the market, and then you see them appearing in other truck types as well. It all grows together. It's unclear how that would evolve if long haul trucks could be battery electric or something else. Without substantial penetration of ZEV technology into the truck sector, emissions reductions would likely have to be driven by biofuels, and this is challenging in a number of ways. One is simply the supply question. Where are we going to get cellulosic biofuels in volume? How do we make sure they're sustainable? And they also do result in higher fuel costs, declining over time, but in the 2030 to 2040 timeframe, it has a big impact on fuel costs. So that's also a policy question. The last slide has a whole lot of conclusions, and we decided we're not going to walk through that. It's too much. It's basically a rephrasing of lots of things that we've said over the last half hour, and I think what we'd really like to do now is turn it over to Colin and hear from him and then take some questions. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Lou and Marshall. And I just want to say, when I came back to UC Davis about a year ago, I started trying to familiarize myself with this project. And as I started digging into this model, there is a tremendous amount of detail and thought that went into it. And so I absolutely appreciate the amount of work and effort that's gone into this on a really critical area. I think Lou and Marshall covered a lot of the really key policy implications, but there's sort of three things that really stand out to me from this work that I wanted to highlight for the audience. And one of them is, and perhaps with this, I may be sort of going back to my roots in advocacy, so I apologize if I'm putting on my advocate hat a bit too much, but I think the study really highlights the degree to which ZEVs should be viewed more as an investment than a cost. Because all the evidence right now says that, particularly on the EV side, the long-term savings in fuels and maintenance give them a really favorable total cost of ownership compared to conventional internal combustion engine vehicles. And as the costs on the ZEVs keep coming down, that operational cost difference will become more and more important. And so I think as we talk about this with policymakers, with members of the community, I think sort of to really frame this as making the transition to ZEVs will entail some short-term costs. There's absolutely a vehicle purchase price difference, and then there's going to be for some time, but it's an investment that if it doesn't already pay itself back, will soon start paying itself back over the life of the vehicle. And so framing this as an investment, I think, is both more accurate and also helps frame the issue for achieving the long-term climate goals we want. The second is, like Lou and Marshall said, there are a lot of opportunities for biofuels, but there are also limitations on biofuels. I think the biofuel scenario they present does a good job of saying, of recognizing that limitation and sort of showing that in order to yield an equal amount of emissions reductions to a very high ZEV scenario requires a really extremely high volume of biofuels to be brought in, particularly cellulosic biofuels, in ways that may be feasible if technology continues to develop, but may not. And so I think this really shows the need for ZEVs to be kind of the foundation technology on which long-term sustainability in the medium and heavy-duty sectors are built. Even if we think that the cellulosic fuel production technology will develop to the point where it could cost effectively meet the kind of volumes that we're talking about here, it's important to recognize cellulosic does not necessarily mean sustainable. You still have to produce biomass. There are still land use change and soil carbon impacts. There's still fertilizer needs. And so there's multiple ways in which the cellulosic outcome is challenging. There is absolutely going to be a significant role for biofuels in both the on-road and non-road transportation sectors, but they're not a get-out-of-jail-free card and from the other transitions that have to happen. And even if cellulose comes online in a big way, it's probably not going to be able to sort of be a one-for-one replacement for existing petroleum-based liquid fuels. ZEVs really have to be part of that long-term portfolio. And I think near the end, Lou and Marshall highlighted the big question around hydrogen, particularly for the long-haul sector. They noted that in the current 2050 scenario, hydrogen ends up being the dominant fuel for the medium heavy-duty sector in California, and that's largely because at present for long-haul trucking, it just doesn't look like batteries are going to be able to meet that demand. So there's all these very high mileage vehicles using hydrogen in order to achieve the long-term decarbonization goals. That certainly may be the long-term outcome, but as we look and see with battery developments over the last several years, batteries have gotten cheaper, they've gotten lighter, their cycle life has increased, they've gotten more robust. And so I think it is to some extent an open question about how far into the long-haul segment of the medium and heavy-duty market will batteries ultimately end up penetrating, and what will that do to the long-term fleet composition. I think sort of embedded in that is a sub-question of what's going to be the harder infrastructure challenge to meet, providing a lot of very high power, high speed recharging for very large batteries on medium heavy trucks versus providing the hydrogen distribution and fueling infrastructure to support a fleet of fuel cell trucks. I think that absolutely deserves a lot more study. I think it's like I said, a very open question at this point. But somebody who's been either doing or following a lot of these models for several years now, it seems like every time, by the time you finish a model, you have to go back and revise your battery cost and battery capability provisions, because they've been increasing so quickly, and looks like they're going to be taking over a larger and larger segment of the medium and heavy duty market. So nobody knows how long this trend will hold, but it absolutely deserves attention in the future. So I think I'll stop there and open the floor up for Marshall and Lou to respond to questions. I can chime in if there's any questions that seem more directed at me. But ultimately, I think this model does a really good job of demonstrating the kind of transition that's going to be required to hit these aggressive decarbonization targets. But I think it also shows that when you view this as an investment, not upfront capital cost that will to some extent pay itself back through operational savings over the long term, the fact that the total investment is really not that much different than the BAU case from just replacing the existing conventional vehicles gives a real note of optimism. I think helps show that the transition is more feasible than it might look at first glance. Thanks.
Thank you, Colin. And then we'll get into some questions here. We have quite a few, and I think Marshall will pick up on a few of them to begin with.
So one question is, why do your cost curves start at 2010 when we are 3 months from 2020? Which is a reasonable question. It's really historical. Our model was the old Argonne vision model that was modified by ARB. It starts in 2010. All of the parameters for vehicles, fuels, and so on start in 2010. We use it to compare 2050 greenhouse gas reductions or amounts in 2050 to 2010, but all of the vehicle parameters went back to that. So it's just, we used 2010 as our starting point, and maybe in the future, our plots for at least things like cost might start in 2020. Let's see.
And I guess a follow-up to that is nothing changes across scenarios until after 2020. They're identical until 2020.
Let's see. So are these prices wholesale or retail costs? They're not wholesale. We didn't explicitly include taxes. Another question on the price, on the cost, the fuel price, was, did we include LCFS credits? We did not, although we plan. In fact, we have ongoing projects that will look at modeling LCFS, and we do hope in the future to include a scenario where LCFS for the advanced fuels, electricity, well, for all the fuels, is included.
So yeah, we took the cost structure analysis through to retail price equivalents for vehicles and fuels. So they represent retail prices based on a cost structure. But yes, as Marshall says, we did not include any kind of policy adjustments. It's economic resource type costs that we're looking at in this study.
Well, this question might have been answered later on in our presentation, but by ZEV, do you mean battery electric or fuel cell? We mean either. It's a zero emission vehicle, so both of those count. Actually, in some of our plots, figures, for example, when we say the sales shares for ZEVs, we do include plug-in hybrids in those sales shares, even though technically they're not fully zero emission vehicles. But the contribution of plug-in hybrids is very small to the overall sales shares. So in general, when we say ZEVs, it's reasonable to assume it means battery electric and or fuel cell.
So basic assumptions behind the future estimates, is there any specific limits within the models that may impact the outputs? It is a tough one because there are, of course, so many. We tried to show the various cost assumptions of vehicles and fuels. There's a lot that goes into getting to those cost assumptions. I think a very important basic assumption is like most people are making, is that technologies get cheaper. Batteries, we assume batteries are coming down to, I think at least down to $100 per kilowatt hour. Marshall, you could speak to that.
So the battery
cost.
Well, the full pack cost to the OEM actually goes below $100 per kilowatt hour. We have an integration cost with a factor of 1.4, so all the costs, total battery costs, are above 100, but the actual pack costs themselves fall below, and in case of light-duty vehicles, can fall significantly below $100 per kilowatt hour.
Yeah, and similarly, we have fuel cell systems for fuel cell vehicles dropping below 100 as well. And again, there's a conversion to get to a retail price equivalent. There's an adder. But these are low costs by, let's say, 2025 to 2030, that if you didn't get that, it would change things. But it certainly seems like we're on track for those kinds of future costs.
Okay, so one question says, can we go to slide 11 here? I don't think this, it says, how would the curves on slide 11 change if the y-axis were miles traveled or some other more activity-based metric than vehicle sales?
I guess the stock slide is the closest we have to that.
How come I'm not? I can't have it down. What am I doing there?
So if we bring it, we did not include a travel slide, which we have, and it's shown in the report, but stock is fairly proportional to travel for any given type of vehicle. So if you were to look at, let's say, LH long haul trucks, if we see 50% are fuel cells and 50% are diesel, natural gas, diesel, but basically diesel trucks in 2050, then the travel would be proportional to that. And it tells you something also about the fuel demand. The fuel cells would be somewhat more efficient, so there's a little bit less fuel demand from those than from the diesel trucks. But it all kind of follows in that way.
The one thing that does change, of course, is that for these 10 vehicle types, the vehicle miles traveled per vehicle per year can vary enormously. Long haul actually tends to dominate truck vehicle travel because their vehicle miles traveled can be 100,000, 150,000 miles per year, whereas most of the other trucks are 50,000, 30,000, 25,000 miles per year. So if we did do sort of a sum of all of these by vehicle miles traveled, certain truck types, long haul in particular, would tend to dominate. Another thing is that heavy duty for fuel use would dominate, for fuel use. Another thing is heavy duty pickups and vans, in terms of actual number of vehicles, dominates trucks. It's a factor of 10 in terms of actual fleet stock size compared to many of the other trucks. So one of the problems with collapsing all the truck types together is that you see sort of a disproportionate effect of the vehicle miles traveled for long haul and the number of trucks for heavy duty pickups and vans.
Although it does come out in this slide here that the long haul trucks are there, but all the other trucks combined show up here, and you can see that on average or aggregated across all the truck types, there are about 60% electric and 40% fuel cell by 2050. Driverless vehicles. Yes, it's a good question. We did not include any kind of concept of driverless vehicle or how that might change the way that trucks or cars move. As we said, we are assuming a baseline amount of travel. But the question really would be, let's say for either cars or trucks, does going driverless mean that we would in any way advance or change the picture, the expected evolution of technology? And it's not clear. You might accelerate going to electrification for cars. Certainly, at the same time we are shifting to more on-demand mobility vehicles, like Uber-type vehicles that are being used heavily all day long and are turned over more quickly, that could accelerate a shift to electrification. Something like that's also possible on the truck side, although trucks are probably already used intensively as they're going to be used. So that might not accelerate turnover, but it raises a lot of questions that would be worth a separate study.
There's a question, did we make any assumptions about changes in VMT? We see it growing. Is that accounted for in the modeling? In the modeling, we assume that each vehicle type travels the same VMT now out through 2050. What does change is the number of vehicles, and those go up significantly. So the overall VMT change between now and 2050 is 20, 30, 40% or so. But the actual vehicle miles traveled per vehicle, and we do have a different amount of vehicle miles traveled based on the age of the vehicle, that all remains the same for a given truck type.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we haven't included anything like that in the slide deck, but there is an underlying growth in travel that happens. Like Marshall said, per vehicle, it doesn't really change, but the numbers of vehicles are growing, especially trucks. So the total travel is rising in California. That's in all of our scenarios. I think car travel or light duty vehicle travel is flatter.
It is. The trucks, again, different trucks are assumed, we take this from ARB projections, are assumed to increase at different amounts. The cars tend to increase a little bit less in terms of overall vehicle miles traveled.
Okay, is there any evidence that we can have a cellulosic ethanol at volume? Did you use current pricing or project significant reductions? We recently produced a paper looking at different modeling efforts on cellulosic ethanol and other biofuels, advanced biofuels, and this suggests that we are, it's obvious we're not getting a lot of production right now, and certainly not at large scale. There are very few large scale plants that have gone in, or if they have gone in, that have really been successful. We are not assuming much of this penetration of cellulosic ethanol or cellulose-based biodiesel or renewable diesel fuels until at least after 2025. We think it's still going to take that long to really get that going, and it starts really ramping up in 2030, and it is expensive. We have those fuels starting at over $4 a gallon gasoline equivalent, and then they start to come down over time and get below $4 a gallon. But we kind of have an assumption that we don't really get into very large scale production and use of these things until we've gone through a phase of increasing numbers of medium-sized plants that don't matter much in the big picture in terms of total cost, and that we don't build a lot of large scale production until that cost has gotten down, into the fours, let's say. So it's less expensive than it could have been if you forced it all to happen in the next 5 years. But there's still a cost impact, and there is also a major question about the sourcing of all that cellulose. I mean, you have the billion-ton studies out there that suggest this is quite doable, but we haven't seen it on the ground yet.
Another question is, how will the fuel consumption scenarios play out in regard to the one federal decision? Will these models be rerun with lower fuel economy values? What we assumed in our model is that all the vehicle fuel economies increase with time, with year out to 2050. For trucks, we have an advisor vehicle simulation that we used, and with changing the parameters of the vehicles from today, 2030 and 2050, more efficient batteries, more efficient fuel cells, more efficient tires, and so on. And so we see significant fuel economy increases out to 2050. For long-haul trucks, for example, it's not quite a factor of 2 increase from, I think, 2015 values. I do think that we will probably in the future run some scenarios where we look at perhaps very aggressive or more aggressive, some people might consider that already very, very aggressive, fuel economy scenarios, and look at sensitivities based on that.
And I think, Marshall, we do have, it is calibrated to the light duty and heavy duty national fuel economy standards that are the light duty standards obviously being challenged right now. The heavy duty is not being challenged as far as I know, but those are in there.
Yes, we do attempt to make that comparison and to have numbers that are in line with,
are consistent with that. I think Colin was writing back to people, and maybe we should turn it over to Colin to answer a question or two that aligns with what he's writing here.
Sure. There were some questions from Steve Kafka about biofuels, and I sort of wanted to clarify that the biofuel scenario in this model is largely meant to reflect if you had the BAU case on ZEV deployment continue, which is generally speaking a fairly low to moderate level of ZEVs outside of urban transit buses, and then everything else kind of switching to biofuels in order to make up the balance. So a very large scale replacement of petroleum fuels with biofuels. And I don't know that's necessarily a likely outcome in the real world. I think it's kind of a bounding case. I think the more likely outcome is there will be an important role for biofuels, and there are a number of biofuel feedstocks which are preferable, like Steve mentioned in the chat, things like forestry residues, as well as some of the other organic waste products that don't have another alternative use. And so we're definitely not trying to say that biofuels are not valuable or shouldn't be part of the long-term solution. I think the point is largely that if you don't have ZEVs, in particular EVs, as kind of the foundational technology to take over large fractions of the medium duty and heavy duty sector, it becomes really difficult to make up the full needs for decarbonization out of advanced biofuels. Just because there are so many both technical, economic, and sustainability challenges to get even the cellulosic space up to the really large size that's necessary. I was also trying to ping you and let you know, Don Fenton asked a question about how the electricity costs over the long term were calculated, and I wanted to see if you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Well, first, let me just add one more thought on the biofuels. As you can see here, there is a continuity. There's a lot of corn or various types of ethanol, a little bit of sugar cane, but there's ethanol being produced today. We expect that to continue out to 2030 and the similar volumes in California. Some of that's consistent with what roughly looks like it could happen under the LCFS. It also assumes an improvement in corn ethanol, that there's a lower carbon intensity over time, a somewhat improved carbon intensity that's not shown in this figure. And the same thing with the bio oils, the hydrotreated bio oils. They keep being produced, and we assume that they get more sustainable, lower carbon intensity. They still play a role, but then you can see all of the growth is in, and there's a fair bit of waste streams here too that are not really called out in this figure, but that still if you want to ramp up biofuels a lot, that it makes sense to finally really get into the cellulosic streams, and that's what we're doing in this scenario. Okay, and then we can turn it over to the Dawn question.
Yeah, so that question is, how were long-term electricity prices estimated? So that's an interesting question. Electricity prices are very hard to understand. Today, many people charge their battery electric cars free. In fleets, there's a huge issue of demand charges. If you go over a certain amount of usage, you can incur very high demand charges, and that's very problematic. What we did is, with the new ARB ZEV truck mandate, utilities are talking about coming to fleets and talking about infrastructure and having contracts, long-term contracts, of course, not out to 2050, but long-term contracts for fuel price, pretty much independent, electricity price, pretty much independent of how they're fueling. The number that they've tossed around is 15 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's the number we used in the model. Obviously, all kinds of things could change. For consumers, that price could be higher or lower depending on where they're charging and when they're charging. For fleets, depending on exactly when they lock in rates, how they're charging, how much they're charging, and how those things all change out to 2050. That number of 15 cents could easily go up. It also could go down. We don't know. There doesn't seem to be a lot of people that seem very confident in what the future prices of electricity are. So for the model, we used a flat price, actually shown on the screen here. It's in terms of dollars per gallon of gasoline equivalent, but that is 15 cents per kilowatt hour. Let's see.
We've got 2 minutes left under the normal
yeah.
time frame.
So one question is, what assumptions do you use for unit sales growth, fleet size growth, and scrappage rates? So I talked a little bit about the growth in the fleets or in the number of vehicles. We assume they go up based on what ARB is projected. ARB also includes scrappage rates. We have them fixed over time, so we don't assume that scrappage rates will get higher or lower. They could do either, depending on a number of things, but we fix them in that model.
I'll take one here. Do your estimates take into account savings and costs from reduced environmental damage and health impacts? No, they don't. And of course, these could have a big additional impact. So we haven't looked at external costs and benefits in this study. It's another area that one could follow up and add those in, including the cost of or the value of reducing greenhouse gas emissions themselves. We just haven't put that in. So if you had $50 a ton for the CO2 reductions, it would change some of these costs significantly. So that would be a thing to do. Okay.
One question is, how would potential post-vehicle life and applications of EV batteries make further residual values and influence these studied scenarios? So the idea is that battery pack goes in a car. It is used until what is considered its end of life, which is not well defined as of now. At that point, can it be used in a second life application, for example, stationary power? A lot of people have assumed that the answer is yes, and that ought to reduce the price of batteries, and that could be the case. I will say that one battery expert basically talked to a lot of battery companies and asked them, what if the vehicle manufacturers said to you that they will return you the battery packs at the end of life? How would that affect the price? Universally, the battery manufacturers said the price would go up because dealing with the second life of the batteries, disposing of the batteries, recycling the batteries is rather expensive. That may not always be the case. Maybe it is now, maybe in the future, you could get cost reductions. We did not assume anything in terms of second life and its effect on battery costs.
John's question. I'll answer one here. Do the costs include charging infrastructure? We have built up to the price of fuel for hydrogen, for electricity, and for biofuels, trying to take into account all of the pieces, and that does include charging infrastructure costs. So that is rolled into this fuel price. We could have rolled it into the vehicle price, but that $15 a kilowatt hour is assumed to be a large volume, kind of commercial, average commercial price that takes into account the cost of all that infrastructure. So, you know, that might be high, that might be low, but that's the number that we ended up with.
Okay, so one question is, have you estimated for each vehicle class how the energy demand for transportation changes due to improved efficiency of electric versus conventional vehicles? And are you distinguishing between Class 7 urban delivery versus Class 8 interstate long-haul travel? The second part of that, yes. We have two separate truck classes. One is long haul, usually Class 8, interstate, not returned to base at the end of the day, 100,000, 125,000 miles per year. We have a short haul class, which is mostly Class 7, some Class 8, much lower driving distance, 100, maybe 150 miles per day, returning to base. Those two fuel economies do vary. Typically, the long haul Class 8 has a higher fuel economy because it's dominated by highway travel. Diesel engines tend to be extremely efficient in steady state highway travel, so that fuel economy is larger. You want to try that one?
So we know I'll just comment, we're at time, so we understand that, but we'll go another 10 minutes and just kind of keep trying to take questions for people who can stay on, and then we'll sign off maybe, around a quarter after.
So one question is, how was the $12 per gallon gasoline equivalent hydrogen price in 2015 calculated? 2019 retail hydrogen prices seem to be much higher. That's true. We have seen $16. A gallon gasoline equivalent is essentially the same as a kilogram for hydrogen. Prices of $16 per kilogram certainly exist. The 2015 value actually comes from a study where the use of hydrogen is actually somewhat larger than is what was the case in 2015. It turns out it doesn't really matter. There are essentially no hydrogen vehicles in our study in 2015. There are extremely few, if any, even in 2020. So the hydrogen price really doesn't play any role until you really get out to 2025, 2030, and beyond. But the price of 12 came from a particular study that said price in 2015, you could produce hydrogen from natural gas reformation if the volume was a certain amount at roughly $12 a kilogram. It doesn't really play a part in the study.
Okay, then there's one about costs again. Do they assume public subsidies or incentives? If not, how could you model that kind of variable? And that's interesting. I mean, I think we've said that we are not including those things, but modeling them in a policy-oriented way is a very interesting question. And the truck choice modeling work that we've done allows that sort of analysis, so you can understand how fleets are making decisions. It's very hard to get at it because every fleet is different and it's a very complex topic. But if you make assumptions about what fleets care about when they choose between truck technologies and you use a choice model, like a logic choice type model, you could then apply, let's say, subsidies to the price of certain technology vehicles and see what that does to market shares. So yes, you can model that sort of thing. We've done a little of that. We did not include that in this study, but we plan a truck choice modeling report. We've done one a couple of years ago that's out there, and we're going to update that in the coming months to try to dig into those things a bit more.
If the question is, if we see a major transition to EVs, presumably there would be a collapse in oil prices. Is this factor considered in the analysis? No, we don't consider that in the analysis. We basically take our diesel, natural gas, and gasoline fuel prices from AEO forecasts. Someone else asked what year. We used the 2018 forecast in the AEO. I'm pretty sure it's 2018. But basically, that forecast shows fuel prices going up pretty much steadily from now out to 2050. And we don't try to predict what would happen to oil prices or diesel or gasoline prices based on lower use in transportation.
But they do stay pretty flat. They do end up staying pretty low. We wanted to keep the incumbent fuel prices low and see how the transition looks in that context. We did show one slide with a higher assumption of oil price or gasoline diesel price, and it certainly makes it cheaper to get through the transition. So, but we don't want to game this in any way that sort of somehow artificially makes it seem cheaper. Okay.
Could you provide the assumptions regarding vehicle life? Yes. The ARB vision model includes scrappage rates for all, well, in their model, they included it for cars, light-duty trucks, for medium trucks, and heavy-duty trucks. We used those scrappage rates for cars and light-duty vehicles and for our medium-duty vehicles in trucks and the heavy-duty vehicles in trucks. And those scrappage rates basically determine the lifetime of a truck. There's a certain percentage each vehicle age of vehicles that are scrapped So some vehicles get scrapped after year 2 or 3, others are still in the fleet after year 20. So it basically the stock turnover model takes care of that, and it removes vehicles. Typically, vehicles are removed mostly between age maybe 12 and 18 for trucks. For cars, it's probably a little bit less.
How representative would the study be beyond California, such as other parts of the U.S., North America, the world? I think it's safe to say the technology cost assumptions wouldn't be much different. These tend to be large, international markets. Fuel prices will vary in different parts of the world, certainly, and even in the United States. The carbon intensity, let's say, of electricity, if you used anything like a baseline of where we think carbon intensity of electricity is going, that's going to vary, although we do assume a commitment to deep decarbonization of electricity, and then hydrogen is also coming from that decarbonized electricity. We would tend to do that wherever we're looking at this as part of a climate strategy. So I think there's a lot of applicability, but certainly not complete. Also, the amount of travel that different kinds of vehicles are doing, and maybe what fleets would choose could come out and what consumers would choose could come out quite different.
I'll answer this, but I can do more.
Okay, is that the last one?
Well, so one is, does electricity fuel cost address demand charges or necessary infrastructure investments? So the simple answer is no. We recognize that presently demand charges, especially for trucking fleets, can be fairly considerable. As I mentioned, our assumption is that utilities will work out with fleets contracts that give set constant costs of electricity over some period of time, and those would not, I guess indirectly they could include the idea of demand charges, but the rate itself would be flat. At least that is what utilities,
on average.
Yeah, that is what utilities have reported. That could change over time. Infrastructure investments are actually pretty interesting. Right now, there's a lot of money from the state for utilities to build out infrastructure for fleets, the make-ready infrastructure to the charging stations. And that make-ready infrastructure would be provided, in theory, free, essentially paid for by the state, and maybe to some extent the utilities, with the hopes of making money back in the fuel use. So those infrastructure investments for the present may be covered by state incentives. The real issue is what happens if those incentives go away. We don't know what will happen in the mid to late 20s, or certainly after that. Presumably infrastructure has to continue to be expanded. So it's not clear what will happen for those infrastructure investments. Presumably that money would go in eventually into fuel costs, but we haven't looked at that explicitly in the model.
And I think that's it. I don't see any more questions.
Yeah, I did that.
So I think we're ready to thank everyone. The slides will be uploaded, as Leon says, and we will provide links in a follow-up email so that you can see the report, which is out. And so thank you, everyone, for joining, and always happy to take more feedback, receive emails, or however you can reach us, and questions about the report are welcome, and we look forward to continuing to work in this area and benefit from the kinds of feedback we get. Thank you very much.